Arkansas fans will have a familiar face to watch next season as forward Trevon Brazile returns to Fayetteville, this time to play for Coach John Calipari. Is that it for the Hogs this offseason?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Wednesday. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your solo host for today, Andy Patton. We got a handful of transfer portal updates to get to today. Quite a few different things happening on Tuesday evening we're going to cover here on today's show. Today's show is brought to you, by the way, by Gametime. So folks, download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Shout out to those everyday listeners as well, and shout out those of you who are hanging out with us in the Discord channel. If you want to join us, it is free to join. There is a link in the show notes on your audio or video platforms. Well, folks, we're going to talk Trevon Brazile committing to Arkansas, what it means for John Calipari, what it means for the Hogs. We're also going to talk about Ugonna Onyenso, former John Calipari player who's ended up with the Wildcats, but not the Kentucky Wildcats. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a few other commitments as well to round out the show. But we start in Fayetteville, Trevon Brazile. And I don't know how likely a lot of people felt that this was. But Trevon Brazile, something we talked about, Isaac and I talked about it, I believe, on Monday's episode of Locked On College Basketball. The fit was very obvious for Brazile to return to Arkansas. And the fact that the fit made sense is kind of an anomaly when you consider that none of his teammates are there. It is not like, oh, he's returning back to the same group of players. Of course, it makes sense that he'd fit there. He left there, like Arthur Kaluma returning to Kansas State. That would make some sense because he was a fit there last year when he averaged 14 and 7, and he'd be a fit there again, returning to the same school. But for Brazile, he's returning to a program where none of his former teammates are there. He is the only familiar face at Arkansas. For fans who went to games last year who aren't plugged into every little thing happening in the offseason, I have a hard time imagining you wouldn't know something about the offseason when you get to Bud Walton Arena for the first game next year. But this is the face you're going to remember. This is the player you're going to know. He's the only one coming back for this team. A little bit about Brazile. He entered the portal back on May 1st. He was also in the NBA draft process, withdrew on that deadline day, May 29th, decided to come back to school. For understandable reasons, we've spoken about this a few times on the show, but Brazile is a guy who he had 1 year at Missouri, 2 years at Arkansas. His first year at Arkansas, his sophomore season, he only played 9 games, suffered an ACL injury, missed the rest of that year, missed the start of the next season. And in that next season, which was 23-24, we saw Brazile look fine. He played 26 games last year. He averaged 8.5 points, about 6 boards, 1.2 blocks, shot 35% from 3. He's a 6'10" forward who can block shots, who can hit 3-pointers. That is very valuable. But the production just wasn't quite there. And it was mostly just coming off of a pretty horrific injury. It takes a lot of time to recover from that. And then Brazile comes into the mix. He's got to get into this mix with Eric Musselman's team that had a ton of new players. There was definitely strife in Fayetteville last year, some complications with roster construction. The pieces didn't really fit very well together. So I think for Brazile, coming off a serious injury, coming into a mix on a roster that frankly just didn't work last year at Arkansas, you could understand why the numbers were a little bit depressed, even though they were still solid. He declares for the NBA draft. He's a high-level athlete. There's a lot of expectation that he can and will someday be a quality NBA player. He's a wing who plays good defensively, who hits outside shots. Like he kind of checks a lot of the boxes that the modern NBA is looking for, but he's still fresh coming off of that injury. So he comes back to school, looks for a new home in the portal. And at this point, it was like, is he going to go back to Arkansas? Like we'd heard Memphis was rumored, Nebraska was rumored. We'll talk about them a little bit more later in the show. St. John's, Rick Pitino was involved here. There was a lot of rumors of where this might end up, but Arkansas always made sense because the way that John Calipari has constructed this new roster for the Hogs, this was kind of the missing piece, was a stretch for a power forward kind of capable of stepping into that starting role. Because Cal brought 6 players from Kentucky, 3 of them via the transfer portal. 3 of them are incoming freshmen who were part of his recruiting class last year. And then he adds 2 other transfers. Your 3 transfers coming in from Kentucky are DJ Wagner, point guard, Adou Thiero, who I think was projected to be the starting 4, but is now probably going to slide down to the 3. And then, of course, Zvonimir Ivisic, Big Z, who now probably gets to come off the bench, which is probably better for him. I know there's a lot of excitement about Ivisic and what he can bring, and perhaps he does get a chance to step into a bigger role. They could even play Brazile at the 3 and play Ivisic at the 4 with Jonas Aidoo if they wanted to, but this kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off of Ivisic to be an immediate contributor for this Arkansas team. They also get the 3 freshmen coming in from Kentucky, Carter Knox, Boogie Fland, and Billy Richmond. And then I already mentioned Jonas Aidoo, the center transfer from Tennessee. They also get John L. Davis, one of the best transfer guards in the entire country, coming over from Florida Atlantic. So when you looked at that roster, sans Brazile, that was kind of the gap area. Aidoo is going to start at the 5. You know that Davis and Wagner are going to be your 2 starting guards. You know that Thiero can play the 3. He can also kind of play the 4. And then you have the freshman who can mix in at the 2-3 spots. And then you had Ivisic who could mix in at the 4 or the 5. But now with Brazile stepping in, he starts at the 4. Thiero slides down to the 3. The freshmen get a chance to come off the bench and not necessarily feel all of that pressure right away. If they shine, then Thiero comes off the bench. Great. Like if some of them really shine, they could bring Wagner off the bench, slide John L. Davis down to the point guard spot if they wanted to do that. Coach Cal was incredibly hesitant to have DJ Wagner come off the bench last year, and he had 2 lottery picks coming off the bench instead. So I'm not super confident that that will happen this time around, but it certainly could. I think the ability to now use Thiero is a bit more versatile role, to put a little bit less pressure on Ivisic to perform right away, to have a high-level athlete like Brazile at the 4 who can play good defense alongside Jonas Aidoo. I think that the pairing of those 2 guys just really works out well based on their respective skill sets. You have a familiar face back. I don't know how much that really matters to fans, but I think there's a segment of the fan base that's going to be happy to see somebody they've seen before and see somebody in Brazile who they know is a very talented player who didn't quite get to perform at his expectations because of that injury. Now you maybe get a chance to see that. Brazile could be the best player on this team. He could be the leading scorer on this team. I think John L. Davis is probably the guy you put in the lead right now, but it wouldn't shock me if Brazile is the best player on this Arkansas team. And so I think for John Calipari, he had to sit down with him on Monday night, convince him to return to Arkansas. I think that's a huge move for Coach Cal. I think it's a big move for Arkansas. And I think it's a really good move for Brazile. I think it really works for him. And I think the question now is whether Arkansas is done. Because I project a starting 5, like I just said: Aidoo, Brazile, Thiero, Wagner, and John L. Davis. You have Ivisic and the 3 freshmen coming off the bench. That's 9 guys right there. John Calipari has been pretty adamant that he's not thinking about recruiting a whole lot more than 9 or 10 guys. I have a feeling that they're going to use more than 9 scholarships. I don't know what those future additions will be, whether it's kind of role player types that they find in the transfer portal, whether it's decommitted kids in 2024 that still need a home. Who knows exactly what it's going to be, but I don't think that Calipari is going to call it quits at 9 and a handful of walk-ons, but we'll see. I certainly think that the 9 players currently on the roster is the likely rotation setup for John Calipari next season, unless they can find a way to land like a huge fish, like a Coleman Hawkins or a Jameer Watkins or somebody like that. I suspect that this is the 9 guys that are going to play the majority of minutes for Arkansas next year. We'll have more conversations about how good this team is. Can they compete in the SEC? What is that going to look like? We'll certainly look at that more as we see what happens with Hawkins and Watkins and Kaluma and some of the other big pieces that are still left out in the transfer portal. But right now, hard to not feel at least pretty optimistic, especially considering how bad last year went for the Hogs. I think you got to feel pretty good heading into this next season about where this program is at. Well, we're still talking John Calipari here because his former center, Ugonna Onyenso, found a new home in Little Manhattan. We're going to talk about how he fits with Jerome Tang and the Wildcats coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, Gametime. Folks, it is minor league baseball season, one of my favorite times of the year. I live about 10 minutes away from the local ballpark, and I love having the opportunity to make a spur-of-the-moment decision to head out to the ballpark and catch a game, and that is why Gametime is the perfect place for those last-minute tickets, because prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat feature, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes all of the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who worries about buying tickets from other third-party resellers where you're not sure if the ticket you're getting is legit or if you're going to get turned away at the gate, one of the nice things about Gametime is their ticketing coverage, which means your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. Personally, I love having that peace of mind. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Folks, you can get 2 tickets to a minor league baseball game for like $25. If you download Gametime today, use code LOCKEDONCollege, you can get 2 tickets for $5. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We're still talking about SEC transfers as we got a flurry of transfer news on Tuesday afternoon. We talked about Trevon Brazile returning to Arkansas to play for Coach John Calipari. I want to talk now about a former John Calipari big man, Ugonna Onyenso, who has finally landed at a new home. He is going to play for Jerome Tang and the Wildcats of Kansas State next season. Onyenso spent 2 years at Kentucky, so he's got 2 years of eligibility remaining. Last year, he played about 19 minutes per game. He was a starter early in the year because there was some injuries, some issues going on with Kentucky with eligibility issues with Ivisic and various other things. But in that time, he averaged 3.5 points, about 4.8 rebounds, and 2.8 blocks per game. Onyenso had 66 blocks last year. That is 32nd in the nation. Being 32nd in the nation in blocks, pretty good. Being 32nd in the nation in blocks when you played less than 20 minutes per game and you only played 24 games, that is absurd, obscene, ridiculous. 2.8 blocks per game. And Onyenso, after the season, he was dead set on the NBA. He was I'm leaving. He didn't even talk to Mark Pope on the phone. He'd already entered the transfer portal. He was already in the NBA draft process, he entered the draft process and said, I'm done. I'm not coming back to college basketball. I'm going to be a professional athlete. About a week later, he entered the transfer portal just to keep his options open. And then right before the NBA draft deadline, Onyenso decided to return to school. I think it was a wise decision. I also think Onyenso is not crazy for thinking he can be an NBA player. You look at a guy who averaged 3.5 points per game and you're thinking there's no way that guy should have stayed in the draft process. But he is so long and so athletic and such an elite rim protector in a league where rim protection is at a premium right now. This is a good move for Onyenso to come back to school. But again, he can be an impactful player at the next level, unquestionably. Onyenso had a top 5 back in May. Louisville was in the mix. They added some other front court players, I think, presumably because they didn't think they had a great chance of landing Onyenso. North Carolina was in the mix, and I still think could have been a player here, even after adding Van Allen Lubin from Vanderbilt. I think they need some more rim protection. At times, Oklahoma had been in the mix. I don't know how seriously. Mississippi State and Alabama were both in the mix as well. But Jerome Tang and Kansas State, they find a way to land Onyenso, to bring in the big fella. He's the 7th transfer portal addition for this team. Joins Doug McDaniel coming over from Michigan. Joins Bay Fall from Arkansas. Joins Brandon Housen, a sharp shooting wing from Villanova. That's a nice addition for them. Max Jones, high-level scorer coming out of the Big West. Yes, I had it right. The Big West, where there's a lot of great scoring guards coming out of the Big West. Latrell Wrightsell went to Alabama, was fantastic. Zion Poland went to Florida, was fantastic. Do not discount Max Jones going over to Kansas State out of Fullerton. You also have CJ Jones coming over from UIC, and then Acor from Samford playing buckyball last year. This is a really quality transfer portal class for Kansas State, for Jerome Tang. Onyenso gets a chance to step into a big role right away. He'll play more than he did at Kentucky. He'll have an opportunity to lead the nation in shots blocked. He'll have an opportunity to showcase more of his offensive game. That was what he wanted. He didn't get those opportunities at Kentucky. Like I said, less than 4 points per game. He wants an opportunity to show that he has more offensive versatility while also showing that elite rim protecting skills. He should get those chances at Kansas State in the Big 12, one of the best basketball conferences in the entire country. Also, what this officially means, every player who played for Kentucky last year is not returning to Kentucky. There was never really a super high likelihood of that, especially when Onyenso was the only name left. But now it is finalized. Every player who was a scholarship player at Kentucky last year is either officially out of college basketball, either because of eligibility or because they have kept their name in the draft process, or they have committed elsewhere in the transfer portal. Also, and a side note, Lance Ware, another former Kentucky player, made a commitment on Tuesday as well. He's going to play at UT Arlington, where spent last year at Villanova, so he's not a recent Kentucky departure, but still two former Kentucky bigs finding new homes on Tuesday evening. Also want to talk about Burke Buyuktuncel. This is a name that is not familiar to you. He's a 6'9" freshman last year from out of Turkey who played at UCLA. He has hit the transfer portal and committed to join Fred Hoiberg and the Cornhuskers of Nebraska. Buyuktuncel was one of many international freshmen at UCLA last year that just didn't get it done in the way that Mick Cronin was hoping they would. Adou Thiero from Spain was the most notable example, a draft prospect who did not even come close to looking like a draft prospect last year. Buyuktuncel was in that conversation as well. John Vide, who's now transferred to LMU. There's a handful of others as well. Just a lot of things didn't go well for UCLA last year, and one of them was the fact that these international prospects didn't seem to jive and acclimate to the college basketball game, maybe as quickly or as much as Cronin and the Bruins would have hoped. But Buyuktuncel showed a lot of promise. Finished the season averaging 4.5 points, 2.5 boards, about 16 minutes a game, played in 26 games, missed the start of the season, but was, I think he made his debut in the game against Gonzaga in the third game of the Maui Invitational. Wasn't super efficient, about 43% on 2-pointers, a little under 30% from 3, but there's still a lot of upside. He's already showing up on mock drafts for 2025. There's some optimism that 6'9", stretch 4, good 3-point shooter, high-level athlete. If he puts the pieces together, if the fit works in Hoiberg's system at Nebraska, that he could be a guy who kind of pops and ends up in that conversation. And the playing time is going to be there because he helps replace Rink Mast, who was phenomenal last year. He is a transfer from Bradley, spent last year at Nebraska, but is undergoing surgery and will miss the entire 2024-25 season. So Nebraska needed some help in the front court. They'd already added Braxton Mia from Washington. That was a nice quality transfer portal addition for them. But now between having Mia and Buyuktuncel, they have more depth in the front court. I think this helps this team be a lot more competitive in the Big Ten. They also bring in Raleigh Wooster from Utah, Connor Esigian from Wisconsin, Gavin Griffiths from Rutgers, and Andrew Morgan from North Dakota State in what is shaping up to be a very quality transfer portal class for Hoiberg and Nebraska. Excited to see what Buyuktuncel can do in a different system after having a year of experience at the college level under his belt. Don't be surprised if he's kind of a name that pops at some point during the season next year. Well, folks, the state of Utah had 2 programs, both now in the Big 12 Conference. They made some big moves recently. The Utes landed a big guard, and BYU is shoring up the front court. We're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, folks, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Moving into segment 3 here to continue to talk about some transfer portal and some recruiting additions. This time we're moving over to the great state of Utah, starting with Craig Smith and the Utes as they head into their first year in the Big 12. They have added themselves a big guard-wing hybrid in Mike Sharavjamts, transfer from the University of San Francisco. Mongolian Mike, as he is affectionately known, started his career at Dayton as a freshman in the 22-23 season. He was a top, I think, 75, maybe at some places even a top 50 prospect coming out of high school. Goes to Dayton in the A-10, was a A-10 all-freshman team contributor, but didn't put up huge numbers for the Flyers, about 5.5 points, about 2.5 assists as a freshman. Enters the transfer portal. And I remember this distinctly because I've talked about this on this show. If you are seeing a player's list, their top 5, their top 6, whatever, and there's a school that stands out, usually that's for a reason. And Mongolian Mike released his top 5 at some point last year in the offseason. It was a bunch of high major schools and then San Francisco. And I remember thinking, I bet he's going to end up at San Francisco. Sure enough, he commits to Chris Gerlofson and the Dons. Said that the strong community of Mongolians in the city of San Francisco was a big factor in his decision to go there. He started right away for San Francisco, started all 34 games that he played for the Dons, and he improved his numbers from his freshman year at Dayton, a little under 8 points a game, about 3 boards, 2.5 assists, and shot 36% from 3. But as a 6'8" guard, he had mismatches all the time, and he just never really showed the assertiveness to go try to get a bucket, to drive in the lane, to get contact. His free throw rate was extremely low for a guard of his size who had the ball in his hands as much as he did. USF tried to funnel the offense through him and Jonathan Mobo, who, of course, is now looking at getting potentially picked in the first round or at least the second round of the upcoming NBA draft. And what happened for San Francisco is they had other great guards, Malik Thomas, Marcus Williams, fantastic, but Sharavjamts just kind of deflected a lot. He didn't really show a lot of aggressiveness, assertiveness, trying to get to the rim, trying to find his own shot. But he was a quality three-point shooter. Anytime you can get a 6'8" player who can play the point guard position, you got to feel pretty good about that. And for the Utes, he's the 6th transfer portal addition. He's going to get some guard minutes alongside newcomers Miro Little out of Baylor, Mason Madsen coming over from Rice. I'm very interested to see how this works. Utah had a lot of players that they needed to replace, a lot of changes on that roster as they head into the Big 12 conference. I'm not very confident that Utah is going to make a big impact in the Big 12 right away. This is an incredibly deep, incredibly talented conference. You got Baylor and Houston and Kansas and Iowa State and Arizona at the top. BYU, we'll talk about them momentarily. TCU's in that conversation. Like, there is a handful of other teams that I think are going to be very, very good in the Big 12 next year. Utah, I'm not sure they're going to be in that conversation. I think they might be fighting towards one of those bottom spots in the conference, but I am intrigued. I do think Craig Smith is a good coach, and I think he's navigated the portal well in his couple of seasons, but we'll see what happens in the post-Brendan Carlson era, and we'll see what happens with Sharavjamts, who hopefully can get a little bit unlocked in his 3rd college season and at his 3rd college university. Want to talk a little BYU as well to close out the show. They added a big man from Rutgers, Mayo Meg, coming over, 4-year guy at Rutgers. He's got 1 year of eligibility left. He only played 80 games in his 4 years with Rutgers, 41 starts, about 18 minutes a game. A decent performance last year for him, 9 points, about 4 boards, a little over an assist, a little over a steal per game, but it was only in 17 games as injuries have been part of the equation for Meg throughout his career. He's the 2nd transfer portal addition for BYU, and new coach Kevin Young joining Keba Keita, who comes over from Utah. So another connection there to the Utes. So 2 bigs joining the program out of the transfer portal for BYU. The big thing that the Cougars have been able to do since hiring Kevin Young, who is an assistant coach for the Phoenix Suns, comes in to, of course, replace Mark Pope, who heads out to Kentucky, his alma mater. Kevin Young is recruiting out of the high school ranks better than anybody in BYU history. The recruiting class for BYU is far and away their best high school recruiting class ever, and includes, I think, 2 or 3 of their top 10 recruits ever. Now, this probably was going to happen with a move to the Big 12 regardless. Like, I don't think it's a shocker that as soon as they go from the WCC, which no disrespect to the WCC, but you go from there to the Big 12, you're probably going to start landing higher level recruits. So I don't think that like Kevin Young deserves some of this credit, and his staff deserve this credit. I'm not trying to take it away from them, but there is a caveat that comes along with that information. We see Elijah Crawford. He's a 3-star guard. He was initially committed to Stanford. A Stanford assistant coach took an assistant coach job at BYU and effectively brought Elijah Crawford along with them. Brooks Barr and Brody Kozlowski, are 2 big-time additions for this team as well. But the biggest name coming into the recruiting class is Igor Demin, 6'8" guard from Russia. He is considered a high-level NBA prospect. There's a lot of international players. This is around the time of year, late May, June, where you start to see some international players committing to come over to the United States to play college basketball. It happens every year. We talked about it with UCLA, bringing a bunch of them in last year. There was some NIL reasoning for that in years past at UCLA and at other programs, frankly. But for BYU, they go out and get one of the bigger names, one of the better prospects, a guy that most people are penciling in as a 2025 NBA draft pick. BYU doesn't get a lot of one-and-done caliber guys, but they landed one here in Demon. He's going to be a really nice fit. I'm very intrigued and excited and optimistic about what Kevin Young's offense is going to look like for BYU. Will it be NBA style? Will there be a lot of isolation ball? How much are they going to favor the three-point shot? How is this all going to work for the Cougars coming off of a Mark Pope system that was definitely spaced out, a lot of three-point shooting, utilizing your bigs as floor spacers and connectors as opposed to just low-post stalwarts? I think you look at this roster the way it's currently constructed, you're kind of looking at a lot of similarities. They had a lot of returners. I think that's a rarity, and it's in it of itself that they didn't lose a bunch of guys to the transfer portal. They lost some, Ali Khalifa, Noah Waterman, obviously Jackson Robinson was a massive loss as he goes over to Kentucky. The other two are at Louisville. They lose Spencer Johnson to graduation, but they returned Dallin Hall, their starting point guard. They returned Richie Saunders. Fousseyni Traore is back. He was a really good player for them last year. Trevin Knell's back. Dawson Baker, who only played a few games last year as a transfer addition, he comes back as well. There's a lot of optimism in my mind that the program in Provo is going to be just fine, even with a new coach, even with losing some of their best players. even with only 2 transfer portal additions and both of them being defensive focused bigs and not necessarily high level scorers or really just high profile players at all. Keita and Mag are not big names in the transfer portal, but with Demir coming in, or Demin coming in, the Russian, I think that there's some optimism that this team's going to be in pretty good shape next year. Now, again, I can't project any team finish higher than 5th in the Big 12 unless that team is one of Kansas, Houston, Baylor, Iowa State, or Arizona, because I think that's your top 10, your top 5, and I think all those teams are potentially top 10 teams in the country at the start of the season, at least top 15, almost certainly. So I don't know that BYU's in that conversation, but can they be a team that finishes in the top 8 in the Big 12? Can they be a team that gets a 6 seed or higher like they did last year in the NCAA tournament? Yeah. And when you lose a really good coach in Mark Pope, and you have to make kind of a last-minute hire, and Kevin Young, a guy who's never coached as a head coach at the collegiate level, if you can do that and still turn this program around and have them be a top half team in the best basketball conference in the country, that is a massive win for BYU. Excited to see how both these Utah schools do in the Big 12 next year. Utah, of course, in their first year, BYU in their second year. It's going to be fun to track. Well, folks, that's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. I'll be back for tomorrow's show talking with a very fun guest. Then Isaac and I will be back on Friday to wrap up the week, get you ready for the weekend, and get you ready for all the college basketball action coming your way next week. Thanks to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners. And, of course, apologies, as always, to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats, picking up a big edition today. And until tomorrow, peace.